return in blazing magnificence. Ezekiel experienced the impossible, a priest in exile who became heaven's war correspondent. While Jerusalem burned, he saw spinning wheels within wheels, ate scrolls that tasted like honey, and watched an entire valley of skeletons resurrect before his eyes. This isn't just prophecy, it's divine theater. Ezekiel bridges Israel's darkest hour with its brightest future, revealing how God transforms catastrophic judgment into glorious restoration. His visions span from Babylon's rivers to the millennial kingdom, showing us that God's plans never fail. They only get more spectacular. Every bizarre action, every mystical vision, every detailed measurement points to one earth-shattering truth. Our God specializes in bringing dead things back to life. Get ready for the most visually explosive prophetic journey in Scripture. Ezekiel was 30 years old, living as a prisoner among thousands of Jewish exiles by the Kibar River in Babylon. He should have been serving as a priest in Jerusalem's temple, but instead he found himself in a foreign land, far from home. Then on his 30th birthday, something happened that would change everything. The heavens opened above him like a door being torn wide. What Ezekiel saw next defied everything he thought he knew about God. A huge storm cloud appeared, glowing with fire and surrounded by brilliant light. From the center of the fire came 4 living creatures, unlike anything on earth. Each creature had 4 faces and 4 wings, and their legs were straight with feet like polished bronze, as chapter 1 verse 6 describes. Each of the 4 had the face of a human being, and on the right side each had the face of a lion, on the left the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. The human face looked forward, the lion faced right, the ox faced left, and the eagle looked backward. These weren't just decorative features. Each face had deep meaning that Ezekiel would understand later. The creatures moved in perfect unity, never turning as they went. Fire flickered back and forth between them constantly, and lightning shot out from the flames. When they moved, they looked like flashes of lightning racing across the sky. The sound they made was incredible, like the roar of rushing waters or the voice of God himself. But that wasn't all. Beside each creature sat a wheel that sparkled like topaz. These wheels were enormous, and here's what made Ezekiel's heart race. They were covered with eyes. Chapter 1 verse 18 tells us, "Their rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around." Imagine wheels taller than a man, gleaming like precious stones, with hundreds of eyes watching everything. The wheels could move in any direction without turning, and wherever the creatures went, the wheels went too. When the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose with them. The spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels, making them move as one. Above these amazing creatures stretched something that looked like a crystal dome, sparkling and beautiful beyond description. Above that crystal expanse sat a throne made of what appeared to be brilliant blue sapphire. And on that throne was a figure that looked like a man, but glowed with incredible light. From his waist up, the figure looked like glowing metal in a blazing fire. From his waist down, he appeared to be made of fire itself, surrounded by brilliant light. A rainbow encircled him, shining like an emerald after the rain. This was the appearance of the glory of the Lord, and when Ezekiel saw it, he fell face down on the ground, completely overwhelmed. While Ezekiel lay there with his face in the dirt, trembling before God's glory, he heard a voice speaking to him. The voice was gentle but powerful, calling him Son of Man, a title that reminded him he was just a human being standing before the Creator of the universe. Son of Man, stand up on your feet, and I will speak to you, God said. As soon as these words were spoken, the Spirit entered Ezekiel and lifted him to his feet. He stood there, still shaking, as God began to give him the most difficult assignment anyone could imagine. God explained that he was sending Ezekiel to the Israelites, a rebellious nation that had turned against their Creator. These weren't strangers. They were his own people, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But they had become stubborn and hard-hearted, refusing to listen to God's voice. As chapter 2, verse 4 records God's words, "The people to whom I am sending you are obstinate and stubborn. Say to them, 'This is what the sovereign Lord says.'" Whether they listened or refused to listen, they would know that a prophet had been among them. God warned Ezekiel not to be afraid of them, even though they would be like thorns and scorpions around him. Their words might sting and their looks might frighten him, but he must speak God's words boldly. The people were rebellious, but Ezekiel had to remain faithful. Then something extraordinary happened. A hand appeared before Ezekiel holding a scroll. The hand unrolled it, and Ezekiel could see that both sides were covered with writing. Usually scrolls only had writing on one side, but this one was completely full of words. And these weren't happy words. The scroll contained lamentations, mourning, and woe. God gave Ezekiel a strange command in chapter 3, verse 1. "Son of man, eat what is before you. Eat this scroll. Then go and speak to the people of Israel." God was telling him to literally eat the scroll covered with sad and terrible words. Ezekiel opened his mouth, and God fed him the scroll. Here's the amazing part. Even though the scroll was full of judgments and warnings about coming disaster, it tasted as sweet as honey in Ezekiel's mouth. The word of God, even when it contained difficult messages, was still precious and good. After Ezekiel ate the entire scroll, God told him that these words would become the message he would carry to the house of Israel. But God had more warnings for his new prophet. The people wouldn't want to listen to Ezekiel because they didn't want to listen to God himself. They were hard-headed and stubborn. To help Ezekiel stand against their resistance, God made him just as determined as they were stubborn. "I will make your forehead like the hardest stone, harder than flint," God promised in chapter 3, verse 9. "Do not be afraid of them or terrified by them, though they are a rebellious people." The Spirit then lifted Ezekiel up and took him away. Behind him, he heard the sound of great rumbling as the glory of the Lord rose from its place. He heard the wings of the living creatures brushing against each other and the sound of the wheels beside them, a loud, thunderous noise. The Spirit brought Ezekiel to Tel Aviv, where the Jewish exiles lived by the Kebar River. For 7 days, he sat among them, completely overwhelmed by everything that had happened to him. The people around him had no idea that they were living next to someone who had just seen the throne of God and been commissioned as his prophet. After 7 days of sitting in shocked silence, God spoke to Ezekiel again. This time, he gave the prophet instructions that would make everyone stop and stare. God wanted Ezekiel to create a living demonstration that no one could ignore or misunderstand. First, God told Ezekiel to take a clay tablet, the kind used for writing in Babylon, and draw the city of Jerusalem on it. This wasn't just a simple sketch. Ezekiel had to create a detailed model showing the city under siege. He built tiny ramps leading up to the walls, just like enemy armies would use to attack a real city. Around his model city, Ezekiel set up small camps representing enemy armies. He made miniature battering rams and siege works, creating a perfect picture of Jerusalem surrounded by hostile forces. Anyone who saw this display would immediately understand what was coming. But God wasn't finished with the demonstration. He told Ezekiel to take an iron pan and place it like a wall between himself and the model city. This iron barrier represented how God had turned his face away from Jerusalem. The city that had once enjoyed God's protection would now face his judgment. Then came the part that would test Ezekiel's commitment like nothing else. God commanded him to lie down on his left side and stay there for 390 days. During this time, he would symbolically carry the sin of the northern kingdom of Israel. As chapter 4, verse 5 explains, "I have laid on you the years of their sin. For 390 days you will bear the sin of the people of Israel. After those 390 days were completed, Ezekiel had to turn over and lie on his right side for 40 more days, representing the sins of Judah. That meant 430 days total of lying on his side as a living picture of his nation's punishment. Day after day, month after month, he would lie there as people walked by and wondered what this strange prophet was doing. While Ezekiel lay on his side, God gave him very specific rules about food and water. He could eat only 20 shekels of food per day, about 8 ounces, carefully weighed out. He was allowed just 1/6 of a hin of water daily, roughly 2/3 of a quart. This meager ration showed how little food the people in Jerusalem would have when enemy armies surrounded the city. The cooking instructions were even more disturbing. God told Ezekiel to bake his bread using dried human waste as fuel. This represented how desperate and unclean conditions would become during the siege. When Ezekiel protested that he had never eaten anything unclean in his life, God showed mercy and allowed him to use cow dung instead. Every day for more than a year, Ezekiel lay there beside his model city, eating his small ration of food and drinking his limited water. People came to watch, to question, and to wonder. Some probably mocked him, others felt sorry for him, but everyone understood the message. Jerusalem was going to be surrounded, starved, and conquered. When Ezekiel's 430 days of lying on his side were finally over, his muscles aching and his body weak, God had another dramatic performance for him to carry out. This one would be even more shocking and personal than the siege demonstration. God told Ezekiel to take a sharp sword and use it as a barber's razor to shave off all his hair and beard. In that culture, a man's hair and beard were signs of his dignity and strength. For a priest to shave them off was almost unthinkable, but God wanted everyone to see this dramatic act. After collecting all his hair, Ezekiel had to do something very precise. He needed to weigh the hair on scales and divide it into 3 exactly equal parts. This wasn't random. Every strand had meaning, and the division had to be perfect. What happened next was like watching a powerful drama unfold. Ezekiel took the first third of his hair and burned it with fire in the middle of his model city. The flames consumed every strand, leaving nothing but ashes. This represented the people who would die from plague and famine inside Jerusalem during the siege. The second third of his hair met a different fate. Ezekiel took his sword and struck the hair all around the model city, chopping it into tiny pieces. Chapter 5 verse 2 describes this. Take a third and strike it with the sword all around the city. This showed what would happen to those who tried to escape Jerusalem. They would be cut down by enemy swords. The final third of his hair was scattered to the wind as Ezekiel blew it from his hands. But even then, the demonstration wasn't over. As the hair blew away, representing people being scattered to foreign countries, Ezekiel drew his sword and waved it in the air. This showed that even those who escaped to other lands would face the sword of their enemies chasing them. But Ezekiel was supposed to save just a few strands of hair by tucking them into the folds of his garment. These represented the small number of people who would survive the coming disaster. Yet even this wasn't the end of their troubles. Some of these saved strands would be thrown into the fire and burned up, showing that even among the survivors, some would face more hardship. This whole performance was a perfect picture of Jerusalem's future. The city that had been like beautiful hair on God's head, his pride and joy, would be cut off and destroyed. 1/3 would die from disease and starvation inside the city walls. 1/3 would be killed by enemy swords. 1/3 would be scattered across the world, with enemies pursuing them wherever they went. God explained that this judgment was coming because Jerusalem had become more wicked than the nations around it. The city that was supposed to be a light to the world had become darker than its pagan neighbors. As chapter 5 verse 6 declares, "She has rebelled against my laws and decrees more than the nations and countries around her." The people had rejected God's laws and refused to follow his decrees. They had turned to the disgusting practices of other nations instead of staying faithful to the God who had chosen them. Because of this rebellion, God would execute judgments on Jerusalem that were more severe than anything he had done before or would do again. After the dramatic hair-cutting demonstration, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel again. This time, God told him to turn his face toward the mountains of Israel and prophesy against them. This might seem strange. What had the mountains done wrong? But these hills and high places had become centers of idol worship throughout the land. The mountains of Israel had once been holy, the places where God met with his people, but now they were covered with altars to false gods, high places where people burned incense to idols, and sacred groves where they practiced pagan rituals. What should have been places of worship to the true God had become centers of spiritual adultery. Speaking as God's voice, Ezekiel addressed the mountains directly. Chapter 6, verse 3 records his words. This is what the sovereign Lord says to the mountains and hills, to the ravines and valleys. I am about to bring a sword against you, and I will destroy your high places. The sword represented the Babylonian army that would sweep through the land, destroying everything in its path. These high places weren't just empty hills. They were elaborate worship centers with altars where people offered sacrifices to false gods. There were sacred stones called standing stones and wooden poles called Asherah poles, all dedicated to pagan deities. The people thought these objects had power to help them, but God promised to smash them all into pieces. The judgment would be thorough and devastating. The altars would be demolished, the incense altars would be broken down, and the idols would be smashed to bits. But the destruction wouldn't stop with the religious objects. The people who worshipped there would also face God's wrath. As chapter 6 verse 7 warns, your people will fall slain among you, and you will know that I am the Lord. The very places where people had bowed down to false gods would become their graveyards. They would die right beside the broken pieces of the idols they had trusted in. The devastation would be so complete that dead bodies would be scattered everywhere. Wild animals would drag bones around, spreading them across the landscape. The cities would be laid waste and left completely empty. Where once there had been bustling communities full of people going about their daily lives, there would be only silence and ruins. Yet even in this terrible judgment, God had a purpose. When the people saw their land destroyed and their idols powerless to save them, they would finally understand who the real God was. The destruction would serve as proof that the Lord alone is God, not the wooden and stone images they had been worshipping. Some people would survive this disaster, but they would be scattered among the nations as prisoners and refugees. Even in foreign lands, they would remember what had happened to their homeland. Chapter 6 verse 9 explains, Then in the nations where they have been carried captive, those who escape will remember me, how I have been grieved by their adulterous hearts, which have turned away from me, and by their eyes, which have lusted after their idols. These survivors would finally understand how much their unfaithfulness had hurt God's heart. They would realize that their idol worship had been like adultery. They had betrayed the God who loved them and had chosen other lovers instead. This understanding would make them hate themselves for all the evil things they had done. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel with an urgent and terrifying message. The end was rushing toward Israel like a massive storm, and there was no escape. This wasn't a distant threat or a warning about something that might happen someday. The end had already begun, and it was spreading across the entire land. As chapter 7 verse 2 declares with finality, the end has come upon the four corners of the land. From north to south and east to west, every part of Israel would face God's judgment. There would be no safe places to hide, no regions that would be spared, no cities that would escape. God's patience, which had lasted for centuries, was finally exhausted. He had sent prophet after prophet to warn his people, but they had refused to listen. They had continued in their rebellion, their idol worship, and their violence. Now the time for warnings was over. The time for judgment had arrived. Chapter 7 verse 3 makes this clear. The end is now upon you, and I will unleash my anger against you. I will judge you according to your conduct and repay you for all your detestable practices. God would treat them exactly as they had treated him. Since they had shown no mercy to the poor and oppressed, he would show no mercy to them. The people had filled the land with violence, so violence would return to them. They had ignored God's laws, so they would face the consequences of lawlessness. They had worshipped idols instead of their Creator, so they would discover how helpless those idols really were. When the day of judgment arrived, nothing the people trusted in would be able to save them. Their money, which they had worked so hard to accumulate, would become worthless overnight. As chapter 7 verse 19 explains, they will throw their silver into the streets, and their gold will be treated as a thing unclean. Their silver and gold will not be able to deliver them in the day of the Lord's wrath. All the wealth they had gained through dishonest business practices would be unable to buy them safety. The gold and silver they had valued more than God would be thrown away like garbage. In the day of terror, only God could provide protection, but they had rejected him. The terror would be universal. Kings would mourn, princes would be clothed with despair, and the hands of common people would tremble with fear. Chapter 7 verse 27 describes the complete breakdown. The king will mourn, the prince will be clothed with despair, and the hands of the people of the land will tremble. People would desperately search for answers. They would run to prophets looking for visions, to priests seeking instruction, and to elders hoping for wise counsel. But they would find nothing. The religious leaders who should have guided them had also turned away from God. When the crisis hit, there would be no one left who could show them the way. Disaster would follow disaster in rapid succession. Bad news would pile up like storm clouds gathering overhead. The whole social order would collapse. Everything that had seemed stable and permanent would crumble in a matter of days. It was the 6th day of the 6th month in the 6th year of Ezekiel's exile, 14 months after his first incredible vision by the Kibar River. He was sitting peacefully in his house with the elders of Judah around him, probably discussing the state of their homeland, when something amazing happened again. Suddenly, the same glorious figure Ezekiel had seen in his first vision appeared before him. The figure looked like a man, but was made of fire and brilliant light. From his waist down, he appeared to be fire itself. From his waist up, he glowed like heated metal in a blazing furnace, surrounded by incredible brightness. This glorious being reached out what looked like a hand and grabbed Ezekiel by the hair of his head. Immediately, the Spirit lifted him up between earth and heaven and carried him in visions to Jerusalem, to the temple of God. But what Ezekiel saw there would break his heart and shock him to his core. The Spirit set him down at the entrance to the north gate of the inner court, where something terrible was standing. There was an idol, a statue that provoked God to jealousy. This wasn't just any decoration. This was an object of worship that competed with God for the people's devotion, right there in God's own house. But God's glory was there too, shining just as brilliantly as Ezekiel had seen it by the Kibar River. The contrast was striking. God's holy presence and a jealousy-provoking idol existing in the same sacred space. It was like finding trash in a palace or poison in a medicine bottle. God spoke to Ezekiel, asking him if he could see what the people were doing. "Do you see what they are doing?" God asked in chapter 8, verse 6. "The utterly detestable things the Israelites are doing here, things that will drive me far from my sanctuary." But this was only the beginning. God promised to show him things that were even worse. God led Ezekiel to the entrance of the court, where he noticed something unusual in the wall. When God told him to dig into the wall, Ezekiel discovered a hidden doorway. Behind that secret entrance was a room that should never have existed in God's temple. Chapter 8 verse 10 describes what Ezekiel found. "So I went in and looked, and I saw portrayed all over the walls all kinds of crawling things and unclean animals and all the idols of Israel. The walls were covered with pictures of creatures that God had declared unclean, things his people were never supposed to worship or even touch. In front of these disgusting wall paintings stood 70 of Israel's elders, the very men who should have been leading the people in true worship. Each one held a censer full of burning incense, and sweet-smelling smoke rose from their offerings. But they weren't offering this incense to God. They were worshipping the painted idols on the walls. Among these 70 men stood Jaazaniah, son of Shaphan, a man from a family known for supporting God's prophets. Even he had joined this secret idol worship. As they burned their incense in the darkness, they said to each other, "The Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land." They thought God couldn't see what they were doing in their hidden room. They believed he had abandoned the land and was no longer paying attention to their actions. So they felt free to worship whatever they wanted, in whatever way they pleased. But God saw everything, and he was showing it all to Ezekiel. This wasn't the end of the tour. God told Ezekiel he would see even more detestable things. He brought him to the entrance of the north gate of the Lord's house, where women were sitting and weeping for Tammuz, a false god associated with fertility and the changing seasons. Then God showed Ezekiel the most shocking sight of all. In the inner court of the temple, between the portico and the altar where priests should have been offering sacrifices to the true God, were about 25 men, but they had their backs turned toward the temple and were facing east, bowing down and worshipping the rising sun. These weren't ordinary citizens making a mistake. These were religious leaders, probably priests, who had completely abandoned their calling. Instead of leading people to worship the Creator, they were bowing down to one of his creations. They had turned their backs on God's temple to face the sun, showing where their true loyalty lay. God asked Ezekiel if he thought these things were trivial. The answer was clear. They had filled the land with violence and continually provoked God to anger. Now they were putting the branch to their nose, adding insult to injury with this strange ritual that mocked God even further. After seeing all the terrible things happening in God's temple, Ezekiel heard the Lord call out in a loud voice, "Bring near those who are appointed to execute judgment on the city, each with a weapon in his hand." God was summoning his executioners to carry out the punishment that had been promised. 6 men appeared, coming from the direction of the upper gate that faces north. Each one carried a deadly weapon in his hand, ready to carry out God's judgment. But with them came a 7th man, dressed in linen clothes with a writing kit at his side. All 7 of them went and stood beside the bronze altar in the temple court. The glory of God, which had been resting above the cherubim, began to move. It rose up and went to the threshold of the temple, positioning itself to oversee what was about to happen. From this place, God called to the man dressed in linen who had the writing kit. God gave this man a crucial assignment that would mean the difference between life and death for many people. As chapter 9 verse 4 records, "Go throughout the city of Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over all the detestable things that are done in it." This wasn't a mark of shame, it was a mark of protection. The man in linen was to find everyone in the city who was heartbroken about the sin they saw around them. These were the people who hadn't joined in the idol worship, who were grieved by the violence and injustice, who still cared about God's honor and holiness. While the man in linen went through the city marking foreheads, God spoke to the 6 men with weapons. His instructions were clear and terrifying. Follow him through the city and kill, without showing pity or compassion. Slaughter the old men, the young men and women, the mothers and children, but do not touch anyone who has the mark. The judgment would be thorough and complete, affecting every age group and social class, but it would also be perfectly just. Those who had remained faithful to God would be protected, while those who had rejected him would face the consequences of their choice. God gave one more instruction that showed how the judgment would begin. Begin at my sanctuary. The punishment would start with the religious leaders who had led the people astray. The 70 elders who had been burning incense to idols in the secret room would be the first to face God's wrath. As the slaughter began, Ezekiel found himself alone. He fell face down and cried out, "Alas, sovereign Lord! Are you going to destroy the entire remnant of Israel in this outpouring of your wrath on Jerusalem?" He was afraid that no one would survive this terrible judgment. But God explained that the sin of Israel and Judah was extremely great. The land was full of bloodshed, and the city was full of injustice. The people said, "The Lord has forsaken the land. The Lord does not see." Since they believed God wasn't watching, they felt free to do whatever they wanted, no matter how evil. God would not show pity or spare them. He would bring down on their own heads everything they had done to others. This was perfect justice. They would receive exactly what they had given. Then the man in linen with the writing kit returned and reported to God, "I have done as you commanded." The marking was complete. Everyone who grieved over the sin in the city had been identified and protected. But even as this judgment was taking place, Ezekiel witnessed something that broke his heart. The glory of the Lord continued to move away from the temple. What had started above the cherubim had moved to the threshold, and now it was preparing to leave entirely. The cherubim spread their wings and rose from the ground, with the wheels beside them. The glory of the God of Israel was above them as they moved to the east gate of the Lord's house. There they stopped, hovering at the entrance as if giving the city one last chance to repent. But the city didn't repent. The people continued in their rebellion even as judgment fell around them. So the glory of the Lord finally departed from the city completely, going up from the city and stopping above the mountain east of it, the Mount of Olives. This was the most tragic moment in Israel's history. The God who had chosen Jerusalem as his dwelling place, who had filled Solomon's temple with his glory, who had protected and blessed his people for centuries, was leaving. His presence was departing because the people had made it clear they didn't want him there. The Spirit then lifted Ezekiel up and brought him back to Babylon, to the other exiles by the Kebar River. The vision ended, and he found himself back in his house, but everything he had seen remained vivid in his mind. The next day, he told the exiles everything the Lord had shown him: the secret idolatries, the coming judgment, and the departure of God's glory from Jerusalem. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel with instructions for another dramatic performance that would grab everyone's attention. This time, God wanted him to act out exactly what would happen to the people of Jerusalem when the city fell. The performance would be so realistic that no one could miss the message. God told Ezekiel to pack his belongings during the day while everyone was watching. He was to gather only the essentials, the kind of bundle a refugee would carry when forced to flee their home quickly. As chapter 12, verse 3 explains, "Therefore, Son of Man, pack your belongings for exile, and in the daytime as they watch, set out and go from where you are to another place." Perhaps they will understand, though they are a rebellious people. But this wasn't just about packing bags. God had something much more dramatic in mind. When evening came, Ezekiel was to dig through the wall of his house while everyone watched. He would carry his bundle on his shoulders and leave through the hole he had made, covering his face so he couldn't see the land he was leaving behind. This strange behavior would make people curious. They would ask questions, wanting to know why this prophet was acting so oddly. When they asked, Ezekiel was ready with God's answer. He was acting out what would happen to the prince in Jerusalem and all the people with him. The performance had deep meaning. Just as Ezekiel was carrying his belongings into exile, the people of Jerusalem would soon be forced to pack up and leave their homes. Just as he dug through the wall, they would try to escape through broken walls when the city was under attack. The covered face had special significance too. It represented how the Prince of Jerusalem would try to escape in disguise, covering his face so no one would recognize him as he fled. But even this wouldn't save him from capture. God revealed exactly what would happen to this prince. As chapter 12 verse 13 declares, I will spread my net for him, and he will be caught in my snare. I will bring him to Babylonia, the land of the Chaldeans, but he will not see it, and there he will die. The prince would be captured and taken to Babylon, but something would happen to his eyes, so he wouldn't see the land where he would spend his final days. The people around the prince would be scattered in every direction. Some would flee to Egypt, others to different countries, but everywhere they went, the sword would pursue them. Only a few would survive to tell other nations about all the terrible things they had done. God also gave Ezekiel instructions about eating and drinking that would continue the demonstration. He was to eat his food with trembling hands and drink his water with shaking and fear. This showed how the people left in Jerusalem would eat and drink in terror, knowing that disaster could strike at any moment. The land that had once been full of people and prosperity would become empty and waste. All the cities would be destroyed, and the countryside would be left desolate. When this happened, people would finally understand that the Lord is God. But some people in exile were saying that Ezekiel's visions wouldn't come true for many years, if at all. Others claimed that he was only prophesying about distant times that didn't affect them. God addressed these doubts directly, telling Ezekiel that every vision would be fulfilled quickly and every word would come to pass during their lifetime. While Ezekiel was delivering God's true messages, other people were claiming to speak for God too. But these false prophets were leading the people astray with lies and empty promises. God told Ezekiel to speak out against these deceivers who were causing so much damage. These false prophets weren't receiving real visions from God. Instead, they were making up their own messages and claiming God had spoken to them. Chapter 13 verse 2 records God's command, Son of man, prophesy against the prophets of Israel who are now prophesying. Say to those who prophesy out of their own imagination, hear the word of the Lord. The problem was serious. These prophets were like foxes among ruins. Instead of helping repair the damage, they were making it worse. They hadn't stood in the gaps to protect God's people or built up walls of defense around them. When the day of battle came, these false prophets would be nowhere to be found. What made their deception even worse was how they gave people false hope. When someone built a flimsy wall, these prophets would come along and whitewash it, making it look strong and beautiful on the outside while it remained weak and ready to collapse. They told people peace when there was no peace, encouraging them to feel safe when they were actually in great danger. God promised to tear down these whitewashed walls. When his storm of judgment came, the wall would collapse completely, and people would ask where all that beautiful whitewash had gone. The false prophets, who had covered up the problems instead of fixing them, would be buried under the rubble. But it wasn't just male prophets who were causing problems. There were also women who claimed to speak for God, but were actually practicing magic and divination. These false prophetesses were hunting souls, trapping people with their deceptions and leading them away from the truth. These women made magic charms and veils, using them in their fortune-telling and spell-casting. As chapter 13 verse 18 describes God's anger, This is what the sovereign Lord says: "Woe to the women who sew magic charms on all their wrists and make veils of various lengths for their heads in order to ensnare people." Their magic wasn't just harmless entertainment. They were using it to control people's lives, telling some they would die when God wanted them to live, and promising others they would live when God had marked them for death. They were taking handfuls of barley and pieces of bread as payment for their false prophecies, showing how cheaply they valued human souls. God was furious with these practices. He promised to tear their magic charms from their arms and free the people they had ensnared. Their veils would be ripped off, and their power over people would be broken forever. The reason God was so angry was clear. These false prophets and prophetesses were discouraging good people and encouraging wicked ones. They made righteous people sad with lies, while they strengthened the hands of evil people, encouraging them not to turn from their wicked ways. Because of their deceptions, these false religious leaders would be excluded from God's people. They wouldn't be listed in the records of Israel, they wouldn't enter the promised land, and they would lose their place among God's chosen nation. When God restored his people, these deceivers would be left behind. Some of the elders of Israel came to sit before Ezekiel, probably hoping to receive a word from the Lord about their situation. These were respected leaders among the exiles, men who should have been examples of faithfulness to God. But as they sat there looking righteous and spiritual, God revealed their true condition to his prophet. The Lord spoke to Ezekiel about what was really in these men's hearts. As chapter 14 verse 3 reveals, "Son of man, these men have set up idols in their hearts and put wicked stumbling blocks before their faces. Should I let them inquire of me at all?" These elders hadn't built physical altars or carved wooden statues, but they were idol worshippers just the same. In their hearts and minds, they had set up other gods and given their devotion to things that competed with the Lord. They had stumbling blocks right in front of their faces, things that kept them from seeing and following God clearly. God told Ezekiel to speak directly to them about this heart idolatry. Anyone from Israel who set up idols in their heart and then came to inquire of the Lord would receive an answer, but not the kind they expected. God himself would answer them according to their idolatry, dealing with them based on what they really worshipped rather than what they claimed to worship. The purpose was to recapture the hearts of the Israelites who had turned away from God for their idols. God wanted to win back their love and loyalty, but first they had to acknowledge what they had done and turn away from their false gods. God's message was clear and simple. Repent, turn from your idols, and renounce all your detestable practices. There was still time to change, still opportunity to return to the Lord with their whole hearts. But they had to make a choice. They couldn't serve God and idols at the same time. If anyone, whether an Israelite or a foreigner living among them, separated themselves from God and set up idols in their heart, then came to a prophet to inquire of the Lord, God would answer them personally. But it wouldn't be the comfortable answer they wanted to hear. As chapter 14 verse 8 warns, "I will set my face against them and make them an example and a byword. I will remove them from my people. Then you will know that I am the Lord." God would make an example of such people, showing everyone what happens to those who try to serve two masters. Ezekiel also learned something important about prophets who might be tempted to give false messages. If a prophet was deceived and spoke a word that wasn't from God, it was actually the Lord who had deceived that prophet. Both the prophet and the person who consulted him would bear the same guilt and face the same punishment. This might seem harsh, but God's purpose was clear. He wanted to stop the Israelites from wandering away from him and defiling themselves with sin. He wanted them to be his people in truth, not just in name, and he wanted to be their God in reality, not just in their religious ceremonies. God then gave Ezekiel a sobering lesson about judgment and intercession. Even if the land became so sinful that he decided to destroy it, even the presence of the most righteous people in history wouldn't save the wicked. If Noah, Daniel, and Job were living in such a land, their righteousness would save only themselves, not their children or neighbors. Whether God sent famine, wild beasts, sword, or plague, these three righteous men would survive because of their own righteousness, but they couldn't rescue anyone else. Each person would be responsible for their own relationship with God and their own moral choices. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel with a simple but powerful comparison that would help people understand Jerusalem's true condition. God asked him to think about a grapevine and consider what made it valuable compared to other trees in the forest. The question was straightforward but revealing. As chapter 15 verse 2 asks, "Son of man, how is the wood of a vine different from that of a branch from any of the trees in the forest?" The answer was obvious to anyone who had ever worked with wood. Vine wood was practically useless for building anything. Unlike oak or cedar or other forest trees, vine wood was too soft and twisted to make furniture. You couldn't use it to build houses or craft tools. It wasn't even strong enough to make a simple peg to hang something on the wall. The only value of a vine was in its fruit, not its wood. But what happened when a vine didn't produce fruit? Then it became completely worthless. There was only one thing you could do with unproductive vine wood: burn it as fuel for fire. Even then, it didn't burn very well compared to other types of wood. God was making a pointed comparison. Jerusalem was like a vine among the nations. Its only value was supposed to be the spiritual fruit it produced: righteousness, justice, and worship of the true God. But instead of producing good fruit, Jerusalem had become corrupt and rebellious. Since the city wasn't fulfilling its purpose, it had become like useless vine wood. And just as useless vine wood was only good for burning, Jerusalem would be consumed by fire. The comparison was perfect. A fruitless vine was destined for flames. But God took the analogy even further. He pointed out that vine wood was especially useless after it had been partially burned. As chapter 15 verse 4 explains, "And after it is thrown on the fire as fuel, and the fire burns both ends and chars the middle, is it then useful for anything?" Once vine wood had been damaged by fire, it became completely worthless for any purpose. This described Jerusalem's condition perfectly. The city had already been partially burned by its sins and rebellions. It had been damaged by its unfaithfulness to God. Now it was even less useful than before, like a piece of vine wood that had been scorched and charred. God declared that he would set his face against the people of Jerusalem. Even though they might escape from one fire, another fire would consume them completely. When this happened, people would know that the Lord is God. The land itself would become desolate because the people had been unfaithful. They had broken their covenant with God, so he would make their country a wasteland. What had once been a fruitful land flowing with milk and honey would become as barren and useless as burned vine wood. The message was clear and unavoidable. Jerusalem had failed in its purpose as God's chosen city. Instead of being a light to the nations, it had become darker than the pagan cities around it. Instead of producing fruit that honored God, it had become completely unproductive. Like a useless vine, it was fit only for destruction. God told Ezekiel to confront Jerusalem with all its detestable practices through the most personal and emotional story yet. This wasn't just about political failure or religious mistakes. This was about a broken relationship, a love story that had turned into betrayal and heartbreak. The story began with Jerusalem as an abandoned baby. As chapter 16 verse 3 describes her origins, "This is what the sovereign Lord says to Jerusalem. Your ancestry and birth were in the land of the Canaanites. Your father was an Amorite and your mother a Hittite." Jerusalem came from pagan peoples, not from a godly heritage. When this baby was born, no one cared for her. Her umbilical cord wasn't cut, she wasn't washed with water or rubbed with salt or wrapped in cloths. Nobody pitied her enough to do even these basic acts of care. Instead, she was thrown out into an open field and left to die, despised from the day she was born. But God saw her there. As chapter 16 verse 6 records his words, "Then I passed by and saw you kicking about in your blood, and as you lay there in your blood I said to you, 'Live.' God commanded this dying baby to live, and she did. He made her grow like a plant in the field, and she grew up and developed into a beautiful young woman. When God passed by again and saw that she was old enough for love, he spread the corner of his garment over her and covered her nakedness. He made a covenant with her, swearing an oath to her, and she became his." This was like a marriage ceremony. God was taking Jerusalem as his bride. Then God lavished his love on her. He bathed her with water and washed the blood from her. He anointed her with oils and dressed her in fine clothing, embroidered fabric, leather sandals, fine linen, and costly garments. He adorned her with jewelry, putting bracelets on her arms and a necklace around her neck. As chapter 16 verse 12 describes his generosity, "I put a ring on your nose, earrings on your ears, and a beautiful crown on your head." She was decorated like a queen, wearing gold and silver, dressed in the finest materials. Her food was the best, fine flour, honey, and olive oil. She became very beautiful and rose to be a queen. Her fame spread among the nations because of her beauty. God had made her perfect through the splendor he had given her. She was like a showcase of God's goodness and love, a living example of what he could do for those who belonged to him. But then the story took a tragic turn. Jerusalem began to trust in her own beauty instead of in God who had given it to her. She used her fame to become a prostitute, giving her favors to anyone who passed by. The very gifts God had given her became tools for betraying him. She took the beautiful clothes God had provided and made shrines where she carried on her prostitution. She took the gold and silver jewelry he had given her and made male idols to worship. She even took their sons and daughters, the children God had given them, and sacrificed them to these false gods. Chapter 16 verse 20 reveals the depth of her betrayal. "And you took your sons and daughters whom you bore to me and sacrificed them as food to the idols. Was your prostitution not enough?" She had killed the very children that belonged to God, offering them to idols as if they were mere food. Her spiritual adultery became worse than physical prostitution. Regular prostitutes received payment for their services, but Jerusalem was different. As chapter 16 verse 34 explains, "So in your prostitution you are the opposite of others. No one runs after you for your favors. You are the very opposite, for you give payment and none is given to you." She was paying her lovers instead of being paid. She gave gifts to all her lovers, bribing them to come to her from everywhere for her illegal favors. She was so desperate for the attention of false gods and foreign nations that she would pay anything to get them to notice her. This made God's anger burn like fire. The wife he had rescued, beautified and crowned as queen, had become worse than any ordinary prostitute. She had taken everything he gave her and used it to betray him with other lovers. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel with a riddle and a parable that would reveal the political mistakes Jerusalem's leaders were making. This story used images of great eagles and trees to show how the kingdom of Judah was trying to play dangerous games with powerful nations. God told Ezekiel to present this riddle to the people of Israel. As chapter 17 verse 3 begins the parable, "Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says, a great eagle with powerful wings, long feathers and full plumage of varied colors came to Lebanon. Taking hold of the top of a cedar, he broke off its topmost shoot and carried it away to a land of merchants, where he planted it in a city of traders." This great eagle represented the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. He was powerful and magnificent, with wings that could reach anywhere in his empire. The cedar tree was the royal house of Judah, and the topmost shoot he broke off was King Jehoiakim, whom he had taken captive to Babylon. But the eagle did more than just take the top of the tree. He also took some of the seed of the land, other members of the royal family and nobles. He planted this seed in fertile soil, placing it like a willow by abundant water. This represented how Nebuchadnezzar had set up Zedekiah as a puppet king in Jerusalem. Under Babylon's control, this planted vine was supposed to grow low and spreading, with its branches turning toward the eagle and its roots remaining under the eagle's control. Judah was meant to be a humble vassal kingdom, loyal to Babylon and dependent on Babylonian protection. For a while, this arrangement worked. The vine grew and became a low, spreading vine. Its branches turned toward the great eagle, and its roots grew under the eagle's watch. Zedekiah ruled as Nebuchadnezzar's appointed king, and Judah remained peaceful under Babylonian protection. But then another great eagle appeared on the scene. This vine began to turn its roots and branches toward this second eagle, hoping for better treatment. As chapter 17 verse 7 describes, "But there was another great eagle with powerful wings and full plumage. The vine now sent out its roots toward him from the plot where it was planted and stretched out its branches to him for water." This second great eagle was Egypt. Instead of remaining loyal to Babylon, Zedekiah had begun making secret alliances with Egypt, hoping that Pharaoh would provide military support against Nebuchadnezzar. He was like a vine trying to get water from two different sources, thinking this would make him stronger and more secure. But God revealed that this strategy was doomed to fail. The vine was already planted in good soil with plenty of water. It could have grown into a splendid vine, producing branches and bearing fruit if it had stayed where it was planted. But by trying to reach toward another source, it would be uprooted and destroyed. Chapter 17 verse 9 poses the crucial question: will it thrive? Will it not be uprooted and stripped of its fruit so that it withers? All its new growth will wither. It will not take a strong arm or many people to pull it up by the roots. The answer was obvious. When someone tried to transplant a vine that was already established, especially if they did it by force, the vine would die. Zedekiah's rebellion against Babylon and his alliance with Egypt would not save Judah. It would destroy the kingdom completely. God explained the meaning directly. King Zedekiah had despised his oath to Nebuchadnezzar and broken his covenant with Babylon. Even though he had given his hand in pledge and agreed to be Babylon's vassal, he had rebelled and sent envoys to Egypt asking for horses and a large army. Because Zedekiah had broken his sworn agreement, he would not escape. God himself would bring judgment on him for despising the oath and breaking the covenant. The king would be caught in God's snare and brought to Babylon, where he would be judged for his unfaithfulness. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel to address a saying that had become popular among the people of Israel. They were repeating a proverb that blamed their current troubles on their ancestors' mistakes. The saying went, "The parents eat sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge." This proverb suggested that children automatically suffered for their parents' sins, that God punished innocent people for things their ancestors had done. The exiles were using this saying to claim they weren't responsible for their situation. They were just victims of previous generations' mistakes. But God wanted to set the record straight. As chapter 18 verse 3 declares, "As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, you will no longer quote this proverb in Israel." God was abolishing this excuse once and for all. People could no longer blame their parents or grandparents for their own problems. The truth was simple and revolutionary. For everyone belongs to me, the parent as well as the child, both alike belong to me. The one who sins is the one who will die. Each person was responsible for their own choices and would face the consequences of their own actions. To make this principle crystal clear, God gave Ezekiel a detailed example. Suppose there was a righteous man who did what was just and right. He didn't eat at mountain shrines or worship idols. He didn't commit adultery or sleep with a woman during her monthly period. He didn't oppress anyone, but returned what he took in pledge for a loan. This righteous man gave his food to the hungry and provided clothing for the naked. He didn't lend money at interest or take extra profit. He withheld his hand from doing wrong and judged fairly between people. He followed God's decrees and faithfully kept his laws. As chapter 18 verse 9 concludes, "Such a person is righteous, they will surely live, declares the sovereign Lord." But suppose this righteous man had a son who was violent and committed murder, or did other things his father never did. This son ate at mountain shrines, committed adultery, oppressed the poor and needy, robbed people, and didn't return what he took as pledge. He worshipped idols, did detestable things, and lent money at interest. Would this wicked son live because his father was righteous? Absolutely not. Chapter 18 verse 13 makes it clear, will such a man live? He will not. Because he has done all these detestable things, he is to be put to death. His blood will be on his own head. But the story didn't end there. Suppose this wicked son had a son of his own who saw all the sins his father committed but chose not to follow that example. This grandson refused to eat at mountain shrines or worship idols. He didn't commit adultery, oppress anyone, or withhold pledges. He gave food to the hungry, provided clothing for the naked, and helped the poor. This third-generation man withdrew his hand from sin and didn't take interest or profit from loans. He kept God's laws and followed his decrees. Would he die because of his father's sin? No. As chapter 18 verse 17 promises, he will not die for his father's sin, he will surely live. Each generation was judged on its own merits. The righteous father would live because of his righteousness. The wicked son would die because of his wickedness. The righteous grandson would live because of his righteousness, even though his father was wicked. God made his policy absolutely clear. The one who sins is the one who will die. The child will not share the guilt of the parent, nor will the parent share the guilt of the child. The righteousness of the righteous will be credited to them, and the wickedness of the wicked will be charged against them. But there was more good news. Even wicked people could change their destiny. If a wicked person turned away from all their sins, kept God's decrees, and did what was just and right, they would surely live and not die. God would not remember any of the sins they had committed. Their righteousness would save them. As chapter 18 verse 23 reveals God's heart, "Do I take any pleasure in the death of the wicked?" declares the sovereign Lord. Rather, am I not pleased when they turn from their ways and live? The same principle worked in reverse. If a righteous person turned away from their righteousness and committed sin, doing the same detestable things that wicked people did, would they live? No. They would die because of their unfaithfulness. This wasn't unfair, it was perfectly just. Each person received exactly what their choices deserved. God judged people based on their current character and actions, not on their family history or past mistakes they had repented of. God told Ezekiel to take up a lament for the princes of Israel, using the image of a lioness and her cubs to tell the tragic story of Judah's royal family. This wasn't just history, it was a funeral song for a dynasty that was coming to an end. Chapter 19 verse 2 begins the lament. "What a lioness was your mother among the lions. She lay down among them and reared her cubs." The mother lioness represented the kingdom of Judah, proud and powerful among the nations. She had raised several cubs who were destined to rule, but their stories would all end in tragedy. The first cub grew up to be a strong young lion who learned to tear his prey and devour people. The nations heard about him and trapped him in their pit, bringing him with hooks to the land of Egypt. This represented King Jehoahaz, who who ruled for only 3 months before Pharaoh Necho captured him and took him to Egypt, where he died in exile. When the lioness saw that her hope was unfulfilled and her expectation was gone, she took another of her cubs and made him a strong lion. This second cub also learned to tear his prey and devour people. He broke down strongholds and devastated towns, terrifying the land and everything in it with his roaring. But the nations came against this lion too, spreading their net to catch him. As chapter 19 verse 9 describes his fate, with hooks they pulled him into a cage and brought him to the king of Babylon. They put him in prison, so his roar was heard no longer on the mountains of Israel. This was King Jehoiakim, taken captive to Babylon when he was still young. The lament then shifted to a different image. Your mother was like a vine planted by the water, fruitful and full of branches because of abundant water. Its branches were strong, fit for a ruler's scepter. It towered high above the thick foliage, conspicuous for its height and many branches. But this fruitful vine was uprooted in fury and thrown to the ground. The east wind made it shrivel, its fruit was stripped off, its strong branches withered, and fire consumed them. Now it was transplanted to the desert in a dry and thirsty land. As chapter 19 verse 14 concludes the lament, fire spread from one of its main branches and consumed its fruit. No strong branches left on it, fit for a ruler's scepter. The royal line of David was coming to an end, with no strong leadership left to guide the nation. In the 7th year, in the 5th month, on the 10th day, some elders of Israel came to inquire of the Lord and sat down before Ezekiel. But God refused to let them inquire of him, because their hearts were still full of rebellion and idolatry. Instead, God told Ezekiel to judge them by making them aware of the detestable practices of their ancestors. From the very beginning in Egypt, the Israelites had been rebellious. God had chosen them and sworn to bring them out of Egypt to a land flowing with milk and honey, but they had to get rid of their idols first. But they rebelled and wouldn't listen. They didn't throw away their idols or forsake the gods of Egypt. God was ready to pour out his wrath on them right there in Egypt, but he held back for the sake of his name, so the nations wouldn't see him fail to deliver his people. Even after bringing them out of Egypt and giving them his laws in the wilderness, the people continued to rebel. They violated his laws, rejected his decrees, and desecrated his Sabbaths. Their hearts were devoted to their idols rather than to God. Generation after generation repeated the same pattern of rebellion. God kept giving them chances to obey, but they kept choosing to follow other gods instead. Now, he was bringing them full circle. They would go back into exile just like their ancestors had been slaves in Egypt. God would gather them from all the countries where they had been scattered and bring them into the wilderness of the nations. There he would judge them face to face, just as he had judged their ancestors in the wilderness after Egypt. As chapter 20 verse 38 promises, "I will purge you of those who revolt and rebel against me. Although I will bring them out of the land where they are living, yet they will not enter the land of Israel. Only those who were truly faithful would be allowed to return to the promised land. The fire of judgment was already kindling." God told Ezekiel to prophesy against the forest of the Negev, saying that fire would consume every green tree and every dry tree. The blazing flame would not be quenched, and every face from south to north would be scorched by it. When people saw this fire, they would know that the Lord had kindled it. All flesh would see that it would not be quenched. But when Ezekiel delivered this message, the people complained that he always spoke in parables they couldn't understand. So God gave him a clearer message. The sword of the Lord was being sharpened and polished, ready for slaughter. This sword would strike the prince of Israel and all the people with him. God would test them with the sword, and it would not be turned back. The sword would strike again and again, a sword for great slaughter, closing in on them from every side. Hearts would melt with fear, and many would fall. God had stationed the sword for slaughter at all their gates, flashing like lightning and grasped for slaughter. Chapter 21, verse 27 reveals the ultimate purpose. A ruin! A ruin! I will make it a ruin! The crown will not be restored until he to whom it rightfully belongs shall come. To him I will give it. The Davidic kingdom would remain broken until the rightful king, the Messiah, came to claim his throne. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel to address the nations that surrounded Israel, starting with those who had celebrated when Jerusalem fell. These neighboring countries thought they were safe from God's judgment, but they were about to learn that the God of Israel was also the God of all nations. First, God told Ezekiel to set his face against the Ammonites and prophesy against them. The Ammonites were descendants of Lot, who lived east of the Jordan River. When they saw Jerusalem being destroyed and the temple being defiled, they didn't feel sorry or offer help. Instead, they clapped their hands in joy. Chapter 25, verse 3 reveals their attitude. Say to them, hear the word of the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says, because you said, aha, over my sanctuary when it was desecrated, and over the land of Israel when it was laid waste, and over the people of Judah when they went into exile. The Ammonites had mocked God's holy place and laughed at his people's suffering. They thought Jerusalem's destruction proved their own gods were stronger than the Lord. But their celebration would be short-lived. God promised to give the Ammonites to the people of the east as a possession. These eastern tribes would set up their camps and pitch their tents among them, eating their fruit and drinking their milk. The capital city of Rabbah would become a pasture for camels, and the whole land would become a resting place for flocks. Because the Ammonites had clapped their hands and stamped their feet and rejoiced with malicious hearts over Israel's destruction, God would stretch out his hand against them. As chapter 25 verse 7 warns, therefore I will stretch out my hand against you and give you as plunder to the nations. I will wipe you out from among the nations and exterminate you from the countries. I will destroy you, and you will know that I am the Lord. Next came judgment on Moab and Seir. The Moabites were also descendants of Lot, living south of Ammon. They had said that Judah was just like all the other nations, nothing special or different. They denied that Israel had any unique relationship with God. Because of this attitude, God would expose Moab's flank, removing the frontier towns that were the glory of the land. He would give Moab along with the Ammonites to the people of the east as a possession, so that the Ammonites would not be remembered among the nations. God would inflict punishment on Moab too, and they would know that he is the Lord. The Edomites faced judgment for their revenge against Judah. Edom had taken vengeance and made themselves guilty by taking revenge. As chapter 25 verse 13 declares God's response, therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will stretch out my hand against Edom and kill both man and beast. I will lay it waste, and from Teman to Dedan they will fall by the sword. God would take vengeance on Edom by the hand of his people Israel. The Israelites would deal with Edom in accordance with God's anger and wrath, and Edom would know his vengeance. Finally came the Philistines, who had acted in vengeance with malice in their hearts and destroyed out of ancient hostility. God would stretch out his hand against them, wipe out the Kerethites, and destroy those remaining along the coast. He would carry out great vengeance on them with furious rebukes, and they would know that he is the Lord when his vengeance came upon them. In the 11th year, on the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel concerning Tyre, the great commercial city on the Mediterranean coast. Tyre had been watching Jerusalem's destruction with greedy eyes, seeing opportunity in Israel's tragedy. Tyre had said about Jerusalem, as recorded in chapter 26 verse 2, aha, the gate to the nations is broken, and its doors have swung open to me. Now that she lies in ruins, I will prosper. Tyre viewed Jerusalem as a trade competitor, and its destruction meant more business for the Phoenician merchants. But God had different plans for the merchant city. He would bring many nations against Tyre like the sea casting up its waves. They would destroy Tyre's walls and pull down her towers, and God would scrape away her rubble and make her a bare rock. The attack would come from the north. As chapter 26, verse 7 identifies the enemy. For this is what the sovereign Lord says, "From the north I am going to bring against Tyre Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, king of kings, with horses and chariots, with horsemen and a great army." Nebuchadnezzar would lay siege to Tyre with all the weapons of war. He would set up siege works, build a ramp up to the walls, and raise his shields against the city. His battering rams would break down the walls, and his weapons would demolish the towers. The dust from his horses would cover the city, and the walls would tremble at the noise of the war horses, wagons, and chariots. His horses' hoofs would trample all the streets, and he would kill the people with the sword. The strong pillars that Tyre was so proud of would fall to the ground. Tyre's wealth would be plundered and merchandise looted. The walls would be broken down and the pleasant houses demolished. The stones, timber, and rubble would be thrown into the sea. God would put an end to the noisy songs, and the music of harps would be heard no more. Chapter 26, verse 14, describes Tyre's final fate. "I will make you a bare rock, and you will become a place to spread fish nets. You will never be rebuilt, for I, the Lord, have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord." The coastlands would tremble when Tyre fell. The princes of the coast would step down from their thrones, lay aside their robes, and clothe themselves with trembling. They would sit on the ground and tremble every moment, appalled at what had happened to the great commercial center. God then told Ezekiel to take up a lament for Tyre, describing it as a beautiful ship perfectly constructed for sailing the seas. Chapter 27, verse 4 begins the description. "Your domain was on the high seas. Your builders brought your beauty to perfection." This ship was made from the finest materials from around the world. Its planks were from pine trees of Senir, its mast from a cedar of Lebanon. Oars were made from oaks of Bashan, and the deck was made of cypress wood from the coasts of Cyprus, inlaid with ivory. The sail was made of fine embroidered linen from Egypt, serving as a banner. The awnings were blue and purple from the coasts of Elisha. Men from Sidon and Arvad were the oarsmen, and Tyre's skilled men were aboard as sailors. Veteran craftsmen from Byblos were aboard to caulk the seams. All the ships of the sea and their sailors came alongside to trade for Tyre's wares. The city was like a magnificent trading vessel, bringing together goods from every corner of the known world. But this beautiful ship would be wrecked by the east winds in the heart of the seas. Chapter 27, verse 34, describes the disaster. "Now you are shattered by the sea in the depths of the waters. Your wares and all your company have gone down with you." When Tyre's king heard these prophecies, he probably thought he was safe because of his wisdom and power. So God gave Ezekiel a message specifically for the ruler of Tyre, addressing his pride and arrogance. Chapter 28, verse 2 records God's words to this proud king. "Son of man, say to the ruler of Tyre, this is what the sovereign Lord says. In the pride of your heart you say, I am a god. I sit on the throne of a god in the heart of the seas. But you are a mere mortal and not a god, though you think you are as wise as a god." The king of Tyre thought his wisdom and wealth made him equal to the gods. He believed his position was secure and his power unlimited. But God would bring foreigners against him, the most ruthless of nations. They would draw their swords against his beauty and wisdom and pierce his shining splendor. In the 10th year, in the 10th month, on the 12th day, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel concerning Egypt, the ancient superpower that Israel had often turned to for help against their enemies. But Egypt had proven to be an unreliable ally. And now judgment was coming to the land of the Nile. God told Ezekiel to set his face against Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and prophesy against him and all Egypt. The Egyptian king thought he was powerful and secure, but God saw him differently. As chapter 29 verse 3 describes God's view, "Speak to him and say, 'This is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, you great monster lying among your streams. You say, the Nile belongs to me. I made it for myself.' Pharaoh claimed to own the Nile River and even boasted that he had created it himself. This was ultimate pride, taking credit for what God had made and acting as if he controlled the source of Egypt's life and prosperity. But God would put hooks in Pharaoh's jaws and make the fish of his streams stick to his scales. He would pull him out from among his streams with all the fish sticking to his scales. Then he would leave him in the desert, him and all the fish of his streams. Chapter 29 verse 5 explains what would happen next. "I will leave you in the desert, you and all the fish of your streams. You will fall on the open field and not be gathered or picked up. I will give you as food to the beasts of the earth and the birds of the sky." Egypt had been like a staff of reed to Israel. It looked strong from a distance, but when people leaned on it for support, it would splinter and pierce their hand. When Israel relied on Egypt for military help, Egypt failed them and made their situation worse instead of better. Because Egypt had been an unreliable ally and had failed to keep its promises, God would bring a sword against the land. He would kill both man and beast, making Egypt desolate from Migdol to Aswan, as far as the border of Cush. For 40 years, no foot of man or animal would pass through Egypt. It would be uninhabited for 40 years among desolate lands, and God would scatter the Egyptians among the nations and disperse them through the countries. But after 40 years, God would gather the Egyptians from the nations where they had been scattered. He would bring them back from captivity and return them to Upper Egypt, the land of their ancestry. There they would be a lowly kingdom, never again exalting itself above the other nations. Chapter 29 verse 15 describes Egypt's reduced status. It will be the lowliest of kingdoms and will never again exalt itself above the other nations. I will make it so weak that it will never again rule over the nations. Egypt would no longer be a source of confidence for Israel, but would be a reminder of their sin in turning to Egypt for help instead of trusting in God. When this happened, the Israelites would know that the Lord is the sovereign Lord. God also revealed that Nebuchadnezzar had worked hard against Tyre, making every head bald and every shoulder raw from carrying loads during the siege. Yet neither he nor his army got any reward from Tyre for all the work they had done against it. Therefore, God would give Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar as wages for his army. Chapter 29 verse 20 explains, "I have given him Egypt as a reward for his efforts, because he and his army did it for me," declares the sovereign Lord. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel again with more details about Egypt's coming destruction. This wasn't just punishment for Egypt's sins. It was also payment to Nebuchadnezzar for the work he had done as God's instrument of judgment against other nations. God told Ezekiel to prophesy and say that the day of the Lord was near, a day of clouds, a time of doom for the nations. As chapter 30 verse 4 warns, "A sword will come against Egypt, and anguish will come upon Cush." When the slain fall in Egypt, her wealth will be carried away and her foundations torn down. The destruction wouldn't be limited to Egypt alone. Cush, Libya, Lydia, all Arabia, Cub, and the people of the covenant land would fall by the sword along with Egypt. All of Egypt's allies and supporters would be swept away in the same judgment. Egypt's proud strength would come to an end. From Migdol to Aswan, people would fall by the sword within Egypt's borders. The land would be desolate among devastated lands, and Egypt's cities would lie in ruins among ruined cities. Fire would consume Egypt's strongholds, and young men would fall by the sword, while women went into captivity. At Tahpanhes, the day would be dark when God broke the yoke of Egypt there. Her proud strength would come to an end, and she would be covered with clouds while her daughters went into captivity. God would inflict punishment on Egypt through the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. As chapter 30, verse 24 describes the process, "I will strengthen the arms of the king of Babylon and put my sword in his hand, but I will break the arms of Pharaoh, and he will groan before him like a mortally wounded man." God would strengthen Babylon's arms while breaking Egypt's arms. He would put his sword in the hand of the king of Babylon and spread it against Egypt. The Egyptians would be scattered among the nations and dispersed through the countries. This was divine justice in action. Nebuchadnezzar had served as God's instrument against Tyre, working hard in that siege, even though he didn't receive the plunder he expected. Now God would compensate him by giving him Egypt as wages for his service. The king of Babylon would come with his army, the most ruthless of nations, and draw their swords against Egypt. They would fill the land with the slain, and God would dry up the streams of the Nile and sell the land to evil men. Chapter 30, verse 13, lists some of the specific judgments coming. "This is what the sovereign Lord says: I will destroy the idols and put an end to the images in Memphis. No longer will there be a prince in Egypt, and I will spread fear throughout the land." Egypt's religious system would be shattered along with its political power. The idols that Egyptians worshipped would be destroyed, and the images they trusted in would be broken. No native prince would rule over Egypt again. It would be governed by foreigners. God would set fire to Zoan, inflict punishment on Thebes, pour out his wrath on Pelusium, the stronghold of Egypt, and cut off the hordes of Thebes. The young men of Heliopolis and Bubastis would fall by the sword, and the cities themselves would go into captivity. In the 11th year, in the 3rd month on the 1st day, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel with a parable about Egypt that would show Pharaoh his true destiny. God wanted the Egyptian king to understand what happened to other great powers that had trusted in their own strength and beauty. God told Ezekiel to speak to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and his hordes, asking them who they were like in their greatness. The answer came in the form of a story about the most magnificent tree that had ever existed. Chapter 31, verse 3 begins the parable. "Consider Assyria, once a cedar in Lebanon, with beautiful branches overshadowing the forest. It was majestic in height, its top above the thick foliage. This cedar represented Assyria, which had once been the greatest empire in the world. It was planted by abundant waters that made it grow tall and strong. Its branches became long and spread out because of the plentiful water that nourished its roots. The tree became so magnificent that it towered higher than all the trees of the field. Its boughs increased, and its branches grew long because of abundant waters. All the birds of the sky nested in its boughs, all the animals of the wild gave birth under its branches, and all the great nations lived in its shade." Chapter 31, verse 8 describes its unmatched beauty. "The cedars in the garden of God could not rival it, nor could the junipers equal its boughs, nor could the plane trees compare with its branches. No tree in the garden of God could match its beauty." God had made this tree beautiful with abundant branches, and all the trees of Eden envied it. It was the most spectacular tree in God's garden, admired by every other tree and creature. But pride entered the heart of this great cedar. Because it was taller than all other trees, and its top was among the thick foliage, its heart became proud of its height. This pride would lead to its destruction. As chapter 31, verse 11 explains God's judgment, "Therefore I gave it into the hands of the ruler of the nations, for him to deal with according to its wickedness. I cast it aside." The most ruthless of foreign nations cut down this magnificent tree and left it. Its branches fell on the mountains and in all the valleys, and its boughs lay broken in all the ravines of the land. All the nations of the earth came out from under its shade and left it. When the great cedar fell, it went down to the realm of the dead, along with all the other trees of Eden. All the well-watered trees, the choicest and best of Lebanon, were consoled in the earth below when the cedar joined them in death. The message to Pharaoh was clear. Just as Assyria had been like a magnificent cedar that grew proud and was cut down, so Egypt would face the same fate. No tree should ever again grow so high as to reach the thick foliage or be proud because of its height. Chapter 31 verse 18 drives home the point. Which of the trees of Eden can be compared with you in splendor and majesty? Yet you too will be brought down with the trees of Eden to the earth below. You will lie among the uncircumcised with those killed by the sword. This is Pharaoh and all his hordes, declares the sovereign Lord. In the 12th year, in the 12th month on the first day, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel with a lament for Pharaoh, king of Egypt. This was a funeral song for a ruler who was still alive, but whose doom was already sealed in God's plan. God told Ezekiel to take up this lament and say to Pharaoh that he was like a lion among the nations, but also like a monster in the seas. As chapter 32 verse 2 describes, you are like a lion among the nations. You are like a monster in the seas, thrashing about in your streams, churning the water with your feet and muddying the streams. Pharaoh thought he was a mighty lion ruling over other nations, but God saw him as a dangerous sea monster that thrashed around in the waters, stirring up trouble and making everything muddy and unclear. God would spread his net over this monster and haul him up in his dragnet. Chapter 32 verse 4 explains what would happen next. I will throw you on the land and hurl you on the open field. I will let all the birds of the sky settle on you, and all the animals of the wild gorge themselves on you. The great dragon would be pulled from the water and thrown onto dry land where he couldn't survive. Birds and wild animals would feast on his flesh, and his blood would drench the mountains, while the ravines would be filled with his remains. When God extinguished Pharaoh, he would cover the heavens and darken their stars. He would cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon would not give its light. All the shining lights in the heavens would be darkened because of Egypt, and darkness would be brought over the whole land. The hearts of many peoples would be troubled when God brought about Pharaoh's destruction among the nations. Many peoples would be appalled at him when God brandished his sword before them, and they would tremble every moment for their lives. Chapter 32 verse 11 reveals the instrument of judgment. For this is what the sovereign Lord says, the sword of the king of Babylon will come against you. Nebuchadnezzar's sword would cause Pharaoh's hordes to fall. The most ruthless of all nations would shatter Egypt's pride, and all her hordes would be overthrown. God would destroy all her cattle from beside abundant waters, and no longer would the foot of man or the hoofs of beasts muddy them. The waters would settle and flow like oil, smooth and undisturbed. When God made Egypt desolate and stripped the land of everything in it, when he struck down all who lived there, then people would know that he is the Lord. This was the lament that would be sung for Egypt. The daughters of the nations would chant it as a funeral song for Egypt and all her hordes. In the 12th year, on the 15th day of the month, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel with instructions to wail for the hordes of Egypt and consign them to the earth below, along with the daughters of mighty nations. God told Ezekiel to ask Egypt if she was more favored than other nations, then to tell her to go down and be laid among the uncircumcised. Egypt would fall among those killed by the sword, and the sword was drawn to drag her and all her hordes away. From within the realm of the dead, the mighty leaders would speak about Egypt and her allies. As chapter 32 verse 21 records their words, from within the realm of the dead, the mighty leaders will say of Egypt and her allies, they have come down and they lie with the uncircumcised, with those killed by the sword. In this realm of the dead, Egypt would find herself among other great nations that had already fallen. First was Assyria, once the mightiest empire in the world. She was there with her whole army, all of them slain, fallen by the sword. Their graves surrounded her grave, all of them uncircumcised, killed by the sword. Assyria had once spread terror in the land of the living, but now she bore her shame with those who went down to the pit. She was placed among the slain, with graves all around her army, all who had fallen by the sword. Next was Elam, with all her hordes around her grave. All of them were slain, fallen by the sword, who had gone down uncircumcised to the earth below. They had spread their terror in the land of the living, but now they bore their shame with those who went down to the pit. A bed was made for Elam among the slain, with all her hordes around her grave. All of them were uncircumcised, killed by the sword. Because their terror had spread in the land of the living, they bore their shame with those who went down to the pit. There was Meshech and Tubal with all their hordes, their graves all around them. All of them were uncircumcised, killed by the sword, because they spread their terror in the land of the living. But they did not lie with the fallen warriors of old who went down to the realm of the dead with their weapons of war. These ancient warriors had their swords placed under their heads and their shields resting on their bones, because the terror of these warriors had stalked through the land of the living. But the more recent fallen nations didn't receive such honor. Chapter 32, verse 28, addresses Egypt directly. You too, Pharaoh, will be broken and will lie among the uncircumcised with those killed by the sword. There was Edom, her kings and all her princes, who despite their power were laid with those killed by the sword. They lay with the uncircumcised, with those who went down to the pit. All the princes of the north were there too, and all the Sidonians, who went down with the slain in disgrace despite the terror caused by their power. They lay uncircumcised with those killed by the sword, and bore their shame with those who went down to the pit. When Pharaoh saw all these fallen nations in the realm of the dead, he would be consoled for all his hordes that were killed by the sword. Even though God had caused his terror to spread in the land of the living, Pharaoh would be laid among the uncircumcised, with those killed by the sword, along with all his hordes. Through all these prophecies against the nations, one truth rang clear. No nation could stand against the Lord God of Israel. From the small neighboring countries that had mocked Jerusalem's fall to the great superpowers that had seemed invincible, all would face the same divine judgment. The pattern was always the same. Each nation had committed specific sins against God and his people. Some had rejoiced over Israel's destruction, others had been unreliable allies, and still others had grown proud because of their power and wealth. Ammon had clapped and stamped in celebration when Jerusalem fell. Moab had claimed Israel was no different from other nations. Edom had taken revenge with ancient hatred. The Philistines had acted with malice and destroyed out of old hostility. Tyre had seen opportunity in Jerusalem's destruction, hoping to profit from Israel's tragedy. Her king had grown so proud that he claimed to be a god sitting on a divine throne. Egypt had been a broken reed that failed Israel when support was needed most. But God's justice was perfect and unavoidable. The same Babylonian army that had destroyed Jerusalem would march against these other nations. Nebuchadnezzar would receive payment for his services by conquering Egypt after working so hard against Tyre. The great cedar of Assyria had already fallen, teaching all other trees not to grow proud because of their height. Pharaoh the sea monster would be caught in God's net and thrown onto dry land to die. All the mighty nations would find themselves together in the realm of the dead, their power and pride forgotten. Chapter 30, verse 26 summarizes the result. I will disperse the Egyptians among the nations and scatter them through the countries. Then they will know that I am the Lord. The sword of divine judgment had been unsheathed and would not be turned back. It would strike nation after nation until all the earth acknowledged that the Lord is God. No power on earth could stand against him, and no alliance could provide protection from his wrath. The nations that had seemed so strong and permanent were revealed to be as temporary as flowers in the field. Their armies, their wealth, their alliances, and their gods all proved powerless when the day of the Lord came upon them. Through it all, God's purpose remained the same, that all people would know that He is the Lord. Whether through blessing or judgment, through mercy or wrath, the result was always recognition of His sovereignty over all nations and peoples. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel again, renewing his calling as a watchman for Israel. God explained the watchman's duty using a simple comparison. When people chose a man as their watchman, he would stand on the wall, watching for danger. If he saw the sword coming, he would blow his trumpet to warn everyone. Chapter 33 verse 4 describes what happened next. Then if anyone hears the trumpet, but does not heed the warning, and the sword comes and takes their life, their blood will be on their own head. The watchman's job was to give the warning. What people did with it was their choice. God had appointed Ezekiel as Israel's watchman. When he heard God's word, he must warn the people. If God said to a wicked person, "You will surely die," and Ezekiel didn't warn them, their blood would be on his head. But if he warned them and they didn't turn, they would die in their sin, but Ezekiel would be safe. The people were saying something that showed their despair. Our offenses and sins weigh us down, and we are wasting away because of them. How then can we live? They felt hopeless under their guilt, but God had good news. As chapter 33 verse 11 declares, "Say to them, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live. Turn from your evil ways. Why will you die, people of Israel?" A righteous person who turned to evil wouldn't be saved by past good deeds. But a wicked person who turned from sin and did what was just and right would surely live. None of their past sin killed, saying, "The city has fallen." Now that Jerusalem had fallen, some people in the ruins thought they could possess the land. But God warned that those in ruins would fall by the sword. Those in the country would be devoured by wild animals, and those in strongholds would die of plague. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel about Israel's shepherds, the leaders who were supposed to care for God's people. These shepherds had failed completely in their duties. Chapter 34 verse 2 declares, "Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock?" These leaders fed themselves instead of the flock. They ate the best food, wore fine clothes, and killed the choice animals, but didn't care for the sheep. They hadn't strengthened the weak, healed the sick, or brought back the lost. They ruled harshly and brutally. Because there was no real shepherd, the sheep scattered and became food for wild animals. They wandered over mountains and hills, scattered everywhere with no one looking for them. God was angry with these false shepherds. He would remove them from tending the flock and rescue his sheep from their mouths. Since human shepherds had failed, God himself would search for his sheep and care for them. He would bring them out from the nations and gather them from all countries. He would bring them to their own land and feed them on Israel's mountains. As chapter 34 verse 15 promises, "I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord." God would search for the lost, bring back the strays, bind up the injured, and strengthen the weak. But the fat and strong he would destroy, shepherding the flock with justice. He would place over them one shepherd, his servant David, who would tend them and be their shepherd. God would be their God, and David would be prince among them. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel to prophesy against Mount Seir, where the Edomites lived. Edom was Israel's brother nation, but they had shown only hatred toward their relatives. Chapter 35 verse 3 declares God's judgment. "This is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, Mount Seir, and I will stretch out my hand against you and make you a desolate waste." Edom would become desolate because of their ancient hostility toward Israel. When Israel was in trouble, Edom had delivered them to the sword instead of helping. At Israel's time of calamity, Edom had joined their enemies. God would pursue Edom with bloodshed since they hadn't hated bloodshed. He would make Mount Seir desolate and cut off all who traveled through it. The mountains would be filled with the slain, and the towns would never be inhabited again. Edom had said the two nations and countries would be theirs to possess, even though the Lord was there. God had heard all their contemptuous words against Israel's mountains. As chapter 35, verse 14 announces, "This is what the sovereign Lord says, while the whole earth rejoices, I will make you desolate." Just as Edom rejoiced over Israel's desolation, God would make them desolate. Mount Seir and all Edom would become waste, and they would know that He is the Lord. After judging Mount Seir, God told Ezekiel to prophesy to Israel's mountains with a different message. While Edom would become desolate, Israel's mountains would be restored. The mountains had suffered greatly. Enemies had claimed the ancient heights belonged to them, but God had good news. Chapter 36, verse 8 promises, "But you, mountains of Israel, will produce branches and fruit for my people Israel, for they will soon come home." God would turn to the mountains. They would be plowed and sown, and people would live on them again, the whole house of Israel. Towns would be inhabited and ruins rebuilt. He would increase people and animals, and they would be fruitful. God wasn't doing this because Israel deserved it. They had defiled the land with their conduct, so He had scattered them among nations. Wherever they went, they brought shame to His name because people said, "These are the Lord's people," but they had to leave His land. Chapter 36, verse 22 explains His motivation. "Therefore say to the Israelites, this is what the sovereign Lord says. It is not for your sake, people of Israel, that I am going to do these things, but for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations where you have gone." God would gather them from all countries and bring them to their own land. He would sprinkle clean water on them and cleanse them from all impurities and idols. The most beautiful promise comes in chapter 36, verse 26. "I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh." God would put His Spirit in them and move them to follow His laws. The desolate land would become like Eden, and ruined cities would be fortified and inhabited. The hand of the Lord brought Ezekiel to a valley full of bones. God led him among them, and he saw very many bones that were very dry. God asked, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel answered, "Sovereign Lord, you alone know." God told him to prophesy to the bones. Chapter 37, verse 4 records, "Prophesy to these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord." God would make breath enter them, attach tendons, make flesh appear, cover them with skin, and put breath in them. As Ezekiel prophesied, there was rattling, and bones came together. Tendons and flesh appeared, and skin covered them, but there was no breath. Then God told him to prophesy to the breath from the four winds to breathe into them. When Ezekiel prophesied, breath entered them. They came to life and stood up, a vast army. God explained that these bones represented Israel, who said, "Our bones are dried up, and our hope is gone. We are cut off." Chapter 37, verse 14 contains God's promise. "I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord." God told Ezekiel to take 2 sticks and write on them. On one he wrote, "Belonging to Judah and the Israelites associated with him." On the other, "Belonging to Joseph," that is, to Ephraim, and all the Israelites associated with him. The kingdom had been divided for centuries after Solomon's death. The northern kingdom of Israel and southern kingdom of Judah had often been enemies, fighting each other instead of standing together. Chapter 37, verse 17 instructs, Join them together into one stick so that they will become one in your hand." When people asked what this meant, Ezekiel would explain that God would join the stick of Joseph to Judah's stick, making them one in his hand. God would take the Israelites from the nations and gather them from everywhere, bringing them to their own land. He would make them one nation on Israel's mountains, with one king over all. Chapter 37, verse 22 describes the reunification. "I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel. There will be one king over all of them, and they will never again be two nations or be divided into two kingdoms. They would no longer defile themselves with idols. God would cleanse them, and they would be his people. David would be king over them forever, and they would have one shepherd. They would live in the land forever. They, their children, and their children's children. God would make an everlasting covenant of peace with them. His sanctuary would be among them forever, and the nations would know that the Lord makes Israel holy." The word of the Lord came about a great future invasion against Israel. This would be led by Gog from Magog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Chapter 38 verse 3 declares, "This is what the sovereign Lord says, I am against you, Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal." God would bring out Gog with his whole army and many nations, Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, and Beth Togarmah. This would be a massive international coalition coming against Israel from many directions. After many days, Gog would invade a land recovered from war, whose people were gathered from many nations to Israel's mountains. The people would be living in safety when Gog advanced like a storm, covering the land like a cloud. Gog would devise an evil scheme to attack peaceful, unsuspecting people living in unwalled villages. He would plan to plunder and loot, turning against resettled ruins and people rich in livestock and goods. But when Gog came against Israel, God's anger would be aroused. There would be a great earthquake, and fish, birds, beasts, and all people would tremble at God's presence. Mountains would be overturned, and walls would fall. Chapter 38, verse 21 describes God's response. "I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains," declares the sovereign Lord. "Every man's sword will be against his brother." God would judge Gog with plague, bloodshed, torrents of rain, hailstones, fire, and burning sulfur. In this way, he would show his greatness and holiness to many nations. God continued prophesying against Gog, giving more details about the battle's aftermath. Chapter 39, verse 2 declares, "I will turn you around and drag you along. I will bring you from the far north and send you against the mountains of Israel." Gog would fall on Israel's mountains along with his hordes and nations. God would give them as food to birds and wild animals. He would send fire on Magog and coastland dwellers, and they would know he is the Lord. The victory would be so complete that Israelites would use enemy weapons for fuel for 7 years. They would burn shields, bows, arrows, clubs, and spears instead of gathering wood from fields or forests. Israel would give Gog a burial place in the valley of those who travel east of the sea, called the Valley of Hamon Gog. For 7 months, all the people would bury the dead to cleanse the land. After that, they would conduct detailed searches. Chapter 39, verse 15 describes the process. "As they go through the land, anyone who sees a human bone will leave a marker beside it until the grave diggers bury it in the Valley of Hamon Gog." God would summon birds and animals to feast on the flesh of mighty men and blood of princes at his great sacrifice on Israel's mountains. They would eat their fill of horses, riders, and soldiers. The ultimate purpose is revealed in chapter 39, verse 21. "I will display my glory among the nations, and all the nations will see the punishment I inflict and the hand I lay on them." From that day forward, Israel would know he is the Lord their God. The nations would understand that Israel went into exile for their unfaithfulness. But now, God would restore Jacob's fortunes and have compassion on all Israel, being zealous for his holy name. In the 25th year of exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th day of the month, the hand of the Lord was on Ezekiel. 14 years had passed since Jerusalem fell, and now God was ready to show him something amazing, a vision of the future temple that would be more glorious than anything Israel had ever seen. In visions of God, he took Ezekiel to the land of Israel and set him on a very high mountain. On its south side were some buildings that looked like a city. As he brought him there, Ezekiel saw a man whose appearance was like bronze, standing in the gateway with a linen cord and a measuring rod in his hand. This bronze man spoke to Ezekiel with an important command. As chapter 40, verse 4 records, "Son of man, look carefully and listen closely and pay attention to everything I am going to show you, for that is why you have been brought here. Tell the people of Israel everything you see." The man began measuring the temple complex with incredible precision. He started with the outer wall that surrounded the whole area. The measuring rod in his hand was 6 long cubits, each cubit being a cubit and a hand breadth. He measured the wall. It was 1 measuring rod thick and 1 rod high. Then he went to the east gate and climbed its steps. He measured the threshold of the gate, which was 1 rod deep. The alcoves for the guards were 1 rod long and 1 rod wide, with 5 cubits between the alcoves. The threshold of the gate next to the portico facing the temple was 1 rod deep. The man measured the portico of the gateway. It was 8 cubits deep, and its jambs were 2 cubits thick. The portico of the gateway faced the temple. Inside the east gate were 3 alcoves on each side, all the same size, and the faces of the projecting walls on each side had the same measurements. He measured the width of the entrance of the gateway. It was 10 cubits, and its length was 13 cubits. In front of each alcove was a wall 1 cubit high, and the alcoves were 6 cubits square. Then he measured the gateway from the top of the rear wall of one alcove to the top of the opposite one, 25 cubits from one parapet opening to the opposite one. The man continued his detailed tour around the entire temple complex. He measured the outer court, which had a pavement made all around it, with 30 rooms facing the pavement. The pavement flanked the gateways and was as wide as they were long. This was the lower pavement. Chapter 40, verse 23 shows the careful symmetry. There was a gate to the inner court, facing the north gate, just as there was on the east. He measured from one gate to the opposite one. It was 100 cubits. The measurements continued with mathematical precision. The south gate had the same measurements as the others. Its alcoves, projecting walls, and portico had the same measurements as the others. The gateway and its portico had openings all around, 50 cubits long and 25 cubits wide. Inside the inner court, the man showed Ezekiel rooms and a pavement. There were 30 rooms along the pavement, which flanked the gateways and was as wide as they were long. Then he measured the distance from the inside of the lower gateway to the outside of the inner court. It was 100 cubits on the east side as well as on the north. The man brought Ezekiel into the inner court through the south gate and measured the south gate. It had the same measurements as the others. Its alcoves, projecting walls, and portico had the same measurements as the others. The gateway and its portico had openings all around. After the detailed tour of the temple structure, the man brought Ezekiel to the gate facing east. What happened next was the moment Ezekiel had been waiting for since he saw God's glory leave the old temple years earlier. The return of the Lord's presence. The glory of the God of Israel came from the east. His voice was like the roar of rushing waters, and the land was radiant with his glory. Chapter 43, verse 3 describes what Ezekiel experienced. The vision I saw was like the vision I had seen when he came to destroy the city, and like the visions I had seen by the Kibar River, and I fell face down. This was the same magnificent glory Ezekiel had witnessed in his first vision by the river in Babylon. It was identical to the vision he had seen when God came to judge Jerusalem. The consistency of these appearances proved that the same God who had brought judgment was now bringing restoration. The glory of the Lord entered the temple through the gate facing east. Then the Spirit lifted Ezekiel up and brought him into the inner court, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. This was the moment of ultimate restoration. God's presence was returning to dwell among his people once again. While the man was standing beside Ezekiel, he heard someone speaking to him from inside the temple. The voice said, as recorded in chapter 43, verse 7, "Son of man, this is the place of my throne, and the place for the soles of my feet. This is where I will live among the Israelites forever." The voice continued with a promise that the people of Israel would never again defile God's holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their prostitution and the funeral offerings for their kings at their death. They had defiled his holy name by their detestable practices when they placed their threshold next to his threshold and their doorposts beside his doorposts, with only a wall between him and them. God had destroyed them in his anger because of their defilement, but now they would put away their prostitution and the funeral offerings for their kings far from him. Then he would live among them forever. God told Ezekiel to describe the temple to the people of Israel so they would be ashamed of their sins. Let them consider its perfection, and if they were ashamed of all they had done, then he should make known to them the design of the temple, its arrangement, its exits and entrances, its whole design, and all its regulations and laws. Chapter 43, verse 12 gives the fundamental principle. This is the law of the temple. All the surrounding area on top of the mountain will be most holy. Such is the law of the temple. The man then showed Ezekiel the altar and gave its measurements. The altar hearth was 4 cubits high, and 4 horns projected upward from the hearth. The altar hearth was square, 12 cubits long and 12 cubits wide. The upper ledge also was square, 14 cubits long and 14 cubits wide. All around the altar was a rim of half a cubit with a gutter of a cubit all around. God gave specific instructions for consecrating the altar. For 7 days they were to make atonement for the altar and cleanse it. Thus they would dedicate it. At the end of these days, from the 8th day on, the priests were to present burnt offerings and fellowship offerings on the altar. Then God would accept them. The man brought Ezekiel back to the outer gate of the sanctuary, the one facing east, but it was shut. The Lord said to him that this gate was to remain shut and must not be opened. No one could enter through it because the Lord, the God of Israel, had entered through it. Therefore, it must remain shut. Only the prince himself could sit inside the gateway to eat in the presence of the Lord. He was to enter by way of the portico of the gateway and go out the same way. Then the man brought Ezekiel by way of the north gate to the front of the temple. As Ezekiel looked, he saw the glory of the Lord filling the temple of the Lord, and he fell face down. The Lord spoke to him with important instructions about who could serve in this holy place. Chapter 44, verse 6, contains God's message. "Say to rebellious Israel, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Enough of your detestable practices, people of Israel." The people had brought foreigners uncircumcised in heart and flesh into God's sanctuary, desecrating his temple while they offered him food, fat, and blood. They had broken his covenant because of all their detestable practices. Instead of carrying out their duty in regard to his holy things, they had put others in charge of his sanctuary. God declared that no foreigner uncircumcised in heart and flesh was to enter his sanctuary, not even the foreigners who lived among the Israelites. The Levites who went far from him when Israel went astray, and who wandered from him after their idols, must bear the consequences of their sin. They could serve in his sanctuary, having charge of the gates of the temple and serving in it. They could slaughter the burnt offerings and sacrifices for the people and stand before the people and serve them. But because they served them in the presence of their idols and made the people of Israel fall into sin, God had sworn with uplifted hand that they must bear the consequences. They were not to come near to serve as priests or come near any of his holy things or most holy offerings. They must bear the shame of their detestable practices. But God would appoint them to guard the temple for all the work that was to be done in it. The priests, who were Levites and descendants of Zadok and who continued to carry out the duties of his sanctuary when the Israelites went astray from him, were to come near to minister before him. As chapter 44 verse 16 explains, "They alone are to enter my sanctuary. They alone are to come near my table to minister before me and serve me as guards." When they entered the gates of the inner court, they were to wear linen clothes. They must not wear any woolen garment while ministering at the gates of the inner court or inside the temple. They were to wear linen turbans on their heads and linen undergarments around their waists. They must not wear anything that makes them perspire. When they went out into the outer court, where the people were, they were to take off the clothes they had been ministering in and leave them in the sacred rooms and put on other clothes so that the people were not consecrated through contact with their garments. God gave Ezekiel detailed instructions about how the land would be divided when the Israelites returned and received their inheritance. This wasn't just about giving each tribe their territory. It was about creating a sacred geography with the temple at its center. When they divided the land by lot as an inheritance, they were to present to the Lord a portion of the land as a sacred district, 25,000 cubits long and 20,000 cubits wide. The entire area would be holy. Of this, a section 500 cubits square was to be for the sanctuary, with 50 cubits around it for open land. Chapter 45 verse 3 gives the measurements. In the sacred district, measure off a section 25,000 cubits long and 10,000 cubits wide. In it will be the sanctuary, the most holy place. This would be the sacred portion of the land for the priests who ministered in the sanctuary and who drew near to minister before the Lord. It would be a place for their houses as well as a holy place for the sanctuary. An area 25,000 cubits long and 10,000 cubits wide would belong to the Levites, who served in the temple as their possession for towns to live in. They were to give the city as its property an area 5,000 cubits wide and 25,000 cubits long, adjoining the sacred portion. It would belong to all Israel. The prince would have the land bordering each side of the area formed by the sacred district and the property of the city. It would extend westward from the west side and eastward from the east side, running lengthwise from the western to the eastern border parallel to one of the tribal portions. This land would be his possession in Israel, and God's princes would no longer oppress his people, but would allow the people of Israel to possess the land according to their tribes. God commanded the princes of Israel to stop their violence and oppression and do what was just and right. Chapter 45 verse 10 gives important regulations. You are to use accurate scales, an accurate ephah and an accurate bath. The ephah and the bath were to be the same size, the bath containing 1/10 of a homer and the ephah 1/10 of a homer. The homer was to be the standard measure. The shekel was to consist of 20 gerahs, and 20 shekels plus 25 shekels plus 15 shekels were to equal 1 mina. God also specified the special gifts the people were to give. This was the special gift they were to offer: 1/6 of an ephah from each homer of wheat and 1/6 of an ephah from each homer of barley. The prescribed portion of olive oil measured by the bath was 1/10 of a bath from each core. The prescribed portion from the flock was 1 sheep from every 200 from the well-watered pastures of Israel. These would be used for the grain offerings, burnt offerings, and fellowship offerings to make atonement for the people. God gave specific instructions about how worship would be conducted in the new temple, including the role of the prince and the schedule of festivals and offerings. The gate of the inner court, facing east, was to be shut on the 6 working days, but on the Sabbath day and on the day of the new moon it was to be opened. The prince was to enter from the outside through the portico of the gateway and stand by the gatepost. The priests were to sacrifice his burnt offering and his fellowship offerings. He was to worship at the threshold of the gateway and then go out, but the gate would not be shut until evening. On the Sabbaths and new moons, the people of the land were to worship in the presence of the Lord at the entrance of that gateway. Chapter 46, verse 4 specifies the prince's offerings. The burnt offering the prince brings to the Lord on the Sabbath day is to be 6 male lambs and a ram, all without defect. The grain offering given with the ram was to be an ephah, and the grain offering with the lambs was to be as much as he pleased, along with a hin of olive oil for each ephah. On the day of the new moon, he was to offer a young bull, 6 lambs, and a ram, all without defect. He was to provide as a grain offering 1 ephah with the bull, 1 ephah with the ram, and with the lambs as much as he wanted to give, along with a hin of oil with each ephah. When the prince entered, he was to go in through the portico of the gateway, and he was to come out the same way. When the people of the land came before the Lord at the appointed festivals, whoever entered by the north gate to worship was to go out the south gate, and whoever entered by the south gate was to go out the north gate. No one was to return through the gate by which they entered, but each was to go out the opposite gate. The prince was to be among them, going in when they went in and going out when they went out. At the feasts and the appointed festivals, the grain offering was to be an ephah with a bull, an ephah with a ram, and with the lambs as much as he pleased, along with a hin of oil for each ephah. When the prince provided a free will offering to the Lord, whether a burnt offering or fellowship offerings, the gate facing east was to be opened for him. He was to offer his burnt offering or his fellowship offerings as he did on the Sabbath day. Then he was to go out, and after he had gone out, the gate was to be shut. Chapter 46, verse 13 gives daily requirements. Every day you are to provide a year-old lamb without defect for a burnt offering to the Lord. Morning by morning you shall provide it. Date: you are also to provide with it morning by morning a grain offering, consisting of 1/6 of an ephah with 1/3 of a hin of oil to moisten the flour. The presenting of this grain offering to the Lord was a lasting ordinance. The man brought Ezekiel back to the entrance of the temple, and he saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple toward the east, since the temple faced east. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar. He then brought Ezekiel out through the north gate and led him around the outside to the outer gate facing east, and the water was trickling from the south side. As the man went eastward with a measuring line in his hand, he measured off 1,000 cubits, and then led him through water that was ankle deep. He measured off another 1,000 cubits and led him through water that was knee deep. He measured off another 1,000 and led him through water that was up to the waist. He measured off another 1,000, but now it was a river that he could not cross, because the water had risen and was deep enough to swim in. A river that no one could cross. Chapter 47, verse 8 reveals the river's destination. This water flows toward the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah, where it enters the Dead Sea. When it empties into the sea, the salty water there becomes fresh. Swarms of living creatures would live wherever the river flowed. There would be large numbers of fish, because this water flowed there and made the salt water fresh. So where the river flowed, everything would live. Fishermen would stand along the shore. From En-Gedi to En-Eglaim, there would be places for spreading nets. The fish would be of many kinds, like the fish of the Mediterranean Sea. But the swamps and marshes would not become fresh. They would be left for salt. Fruit trees of all kinds would grow on both banks of the river. Their leaves would not wither, nor would their fruit fail. Every month they would bear fruit, because the water from the sanctuary flowed to them. As chapter 47 verse 12 explains, Their fruit will serve for food and their leaves for healing. God then gave the boundaries of the land that would be allotted as an inheritance to the 12 tribes of Israel, with 2 portions for Joseph. The northern boundary would run from the Mediterranean Sea by the Hethlon Road, past Lebo-Hamath, to Zedad, Beratha, and Sibraim, then to Hazar-Hattikon, which was on the border of Haran. The eastern boundary would run between Haran and Damascus, along the Jordan between Gilead and the land of Israel to the Dead Sea and as far as Tamar. The southern boundary would run from Tamar as far as the waters of Meribah Kadesh, then along the Wadi of Egypt to the Mediterranean Sea. The western boundary would be the Mediterranean Sea from the southern boundary to a point opposite Lebo-Hamath. They were to distribute this land among themselves according to the tribes of Israel, and allot it as an inheritance for themselves and for the foreigners residing among them and who had children. These foreigners were to be considered as native-born Israelites. Along with the Israelites, they were to be allotted an inheritance among the tribes. God gave Ezekiel the specific allocation of land for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. This wasn't random. It was a careful arrangement that put the sacred district at the center and organized the tribes around it. These were the tribes, listed by name. At the northern frontier, Dan would have 1 portion along the Hethlon Road to Lebo-Hamath. Hazar-Enan and the northern border of Damascus, next to Hamath, would be part of its border from the east side to the west side. Asher would have 1 portion. It would border the territory of Dan from east to west. Naphtali would have 1 portion. It would border the territory of Asher from east to west. Manasseh would have 1 portion. It would border the territory of Naphtali from east to west. Ephraim would have 1 portion. It would border the territory of Manasseh from east to west. Reuben would have 1 portion. It would border the territory of Ephraim from east to west. Judah would have 1 portion. It would border the territory of Reuben from east to west. Chapter 48, verse 8, describes the central sacred district. Bordering the territory of Judah from east to west will be the portion you are to present as a special gift. It will be 25,000 cubits wide, and its length from east to west will be equal to one of the tribal portions. The sanctuary will be in the center of it. The special portion they were to offer to the Lord would be 25,000 cubits long and 10,000 cubits wide. This would be the sacred portion for the priests. It would be 25,000 cubits long on the north side, 10,000 cubits wide on the west side, 10,000 cubits wide on the east side, and 25,000 cubits long on the south side. In the center of it would be the sanctuary of the Lord. This would be for the consecrated priests, the Zadokites, who were faithful in serving him and did not go astray as the Levites did when the Israelites went astray. It would be a special gift to them from the sacred portion of the land, a most holy portion, bordering the territory of the Levites. Alongside the territory of the priests, the Levites would have an allotment 25,000 cubits long and 10,000 cubits wide. Its total length would be 25,000 cubits and its width 10,000 cubits. They must not sell or exchange any of it. This was the best of the land and must not pass into other hands because it was holy to the Lord. The remaining area, 5,000 cubits wide and 25,000 cubits long, would be for the common use of the city, for houses and for pasture land. The city would be in the center of it and would have these measurements: the north side 4,500 cubits, the south side 4,500 cubits, the east side 4,500 cubits, and the west side 4,500 cubits. The remaining tribes would have their portions south of the sacred district. Benjamin would have 1 portion. It would extend from the east side to the west side. Simeon would have 1 portion. It would border the territory of Benjamin from east to west. Issachar would have 1 portion. It would border the territory of Simeon from east to west. Zebulun would have 1 portion. It would border the territory of Issachar from east to west. Gad would have 1 portion. It would border the territory of Zebulun from east to west. The vision concluded with details about the holy city itself and its most important feature, the presence of God dwelling there forever. This city would be the center of worship and government for the restored nation. The city would be square, measuring 4,500 cubits on each side. Around the city would be pasture land extending 250 cubits in every direction. What remained of the area, bordering on the sacred portion and running the length of it, would be 10,000 cubits on the east side and 10,000 cubits on the west side. The produce from this land would supply food for the workers of the city. The workers from the city who farmed it would come from all the tribes of Israel. The entire portion would be a square, 25,000 cubits on each side. As a special gift, they would set aside the sacred portion along with the property of the city. What remained on both sides of the area, formed by the sacred portion and the property of the city, would belong to the prince. It would extend eastward from the 25,000 cubits of the sacred portion to the eastern border, and westward from the 25,000 cubits to the western border. The sacred portion with the temple sanctuary would be in the center of this area. So the property of the Levites and the property of the city would lie in the center of the area that belonged to the prince. The area belonging to the prince would lie between the border of Judah and the border of Benjamin. The city would have 12 gates, 3 on each side, named after the tribes of Israel. Chapter 48, verse 31, lists the north side gates. The gates of the city will be named after the tribes of Israel. The 3 gates on the north side will be the gate of Reuben, the gate of Judah, and the gate of Naphtali. On the east side, which would be 4,500 cubits long, would be 3 gates: the gate of Joseph, the gate of Benjamin, and the gate of Dan. On the south side, which would measure 4,500 cubits, would be 3 gates: the gate of Simeon, the gate of Issachar, and the gate of Zebulun. On the west side, which would be 4,500 cubits long, would be 3 gates: the gate of Gad, the gate of Asher, and the gate of Naphtali. The distance all around would be 18,000 cubits. The most important feature of this city was revealed in the final verse of Ezekiel's prophecy. Chapter 48, verse 35, gives the city its eternal name. The distance all around will be 18,000 cubits, and the name of the city from that time on will be, "The Lord is there." This name captured the essence of everything God had promised through Ezekiel. After all the judgment, exile, and restoration, the ultimate goal was achieved. God would dwell with his people forever. The city's name would forever remind everyone that the Lord had returned to live among his people, never to leave them again. If this deep dive into Ezekiel has opened your eyes to God's amazing love and power, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and join our community of Bible explorers. Your subscription helps us create more content like this, diving deep into God's Word with the respect and wonder it deserves. And please share this video with someone who needs to hear about God's heart for restoration, whether they're going through their own valley of dry bones or just need to be reminded that our God specializes in bringing dead things back to life. Ezekiel's message is exactly what they need to hear. Drop a comment below and tell me which part of Ezekiel's visions impacted you most. Was it the wheels within wheels, the valley of dry bones, or maybe that beautiful promise of a new heart? I read every comment and love hearing how God's Word is speaking to your heart. Thanks for joining me on this prophetic adventure. Until next